Today I want to talk about diligence. So we've talked about diligence in our wisdom series, right? That's a series that we started with entrepreneurs and how to apply kind of like Solomon's biblical wisdom in daily operations. And I feel like the last couple of episodes on Not Yet Mature was very either wisdom or it was off the cuff, where we teach entrepreneurs, or answer their questions that they face in their business. And from a consultant point of view, one of the biggest angles that we do is obviously kind of like life coaching and productivity coaching. And I don't feel that we've spent enough time on the executive management and the executive leadership point of view on managing your business. And today I want to speak about diligence, but also what it is and my angle on how do you scale diligence. Because I think when you scale a business, diligence should scale with it. And we need a couple of tools with that. So how do we scale diligence is the topic of today. And you're so welcome if you're here for the first time. Let's jump straight into it. So, regardless of your religion, worldview, or belief system, I think we can all agree on something. When it comes to everything we do, including our jobs, our businesses, our relationships, our responsibilities, and the way we serve other people, we have a moral obligation to do things diligently. Not merely quickly, not merely adequately, not merely because somebody is kind of like watching us, but diligently. Because diligence is what separates the professional in an industry from someone who is merely experienced in the industry. Experience tells us how long somebody has been doing something. Diligence tells us how seriously they have been doing it. Diligence is often the line that separates the successful entrepreneur from the struggling entrepreneur. And that is not to say that the successful entrepreneur does not struggle. Of course we struggle. I struggle every single day. Every entrepreneur struggles. Every leader struggles. And every business experiences a season where progress feels slow, uncertainty feels high, and every solution seems to produce 3 additional problems. That is apparently one of the privileges of entrepreneurship. But diligence determines how we respond to those problems. It determines whether we avoid them, excuse them, blame other people for them, or take responsibility for solving them. Diligence is often the deciding factor between customers and recurring customers. A customer may buy because your marketing was effective. They may buy because your pricing was competitive. They may buy because you happen to be available at the right time. But customers return because of the way they experienced your diligence. They return because you did what you promised. They return because you paid attention. They return because they felt remembered, valued, and properly served. Diligence is also the core difference between a great physician and a good or average physician. Both may have qualifications, both may understand the basic procedures, both may know how to prescribe the right medication or follow the correct protocol. But the great physician notices the detail that somebody else missed. The great physician asks one more question. The great physician considers the whole patient, not only the visible symptom. The great physician follows up. The great physician takes responsibility for both the science and the human being sitting in front of them. And that is diligence. It is one of the reasons books like Good to Great have inspired generations of leaders because we are drawn to the idea that good is not the final destination. We know somewhere inside us that simply being acceptable is not the same as being faithful to our potential. Diligence is also part of the DNA of the Bible. From beginning to end, Scripture repeatedly speaks about stewardship, responsibility, excellence, wisdom, discipline, and doing our work wholeheartedly. And even if someone approaches the Bible from an atheist or purely literary point of view, it is difficult to deny the diligence involved in its authorship, preservation, historical influence, and internal depth. Diligence is found in the fine print. It is found in the thought process. It is found in the preparation. It is found in the execution. And it's even found in the afterthought. And it is reflected in what happens beyond the delivery of the product or service. Diligence is not only what we do while the customer is watching, it is what we do before they arrive. It is what we do after they leave. It is what we do when something goes wrong. It is what we do when nobody would ever know that we took a shortcut. And if we are going to understand diligence properly, I believe that two things must be present. We often become caught up in the first one, but we frequently forget the second. Diligence requires excellence, but diligence also requires creativity. So let's begin with excellence. Excellence means that we care about the quality of what we produce. It means that we pay attention to detail. It means that we are willing to inspect our work, improve our work, and take responsibility for our work. But we need to be careful here. Excellence is not exactly the same as perfection. Perfection is the demand that absolutely nothing may be wrong. Excellence is the disciplined pursuit of the best responsible outcome within the realities of purpose, risk, time, and of course, available resources. And that difference actually matters because perfection can sometimes become an excuse not to act. It can become fear wearing professional clothing. We tell ourselves that we are pursuing quality when in reality we are terrified of releasing something that might be criticized. So we delay. We overthink. We endlessly adjust details that will make almost no meaningful difference. And eventually our pursuit of perfection prevents us from producing anything useful. Excellence is different. Excellence asks, what level of quality does this responsibility require? What would responsible work look like here? What must not be compromised? What can be improved over time? And what is the best outcome we can responsibly produce with what we currently have? The standard of excellence required for a brain surgery is not the same standard required for an early product prototype. A physician cannot simply say, let us release the operation and improve it after receiving patient feedback. That will be frowned upon for understandable reasons. But an entrepreneur building the first version of a new digital product may need to release something incomplete in order to learn what customers actually need. That's called market validation, and it's also called perceived value and building towards the perceived value. The entrepreneur should not release something dangerous, dishonest, or unusable, but they also should not spend 3 years perfecting a product based entirely on assumptions and internal pride. Excellence is contextual. It is not careless, it is not lazy, but it understands the purpose of the work. A useful definition of excellence is this: excellence is the disciplined pursuit of the best responsible outcome. Let me say that again. Excellence is the disciplined pursuit of the best responsible outcome. It is disciplined because it requires consistency. It is a pursuit because excellence is never completely finished. It is responsible because quality must consider the consequences of our actions. And it is outcome focused because activity alone is not achievement. Being busy does not necessarily mean we are being diligent. Sometimes being busy simply means we have become extremely efficient at avoiding the most important work. But diligence does not only require excellence. Diligence also requires creativity. Creativity is the ability and willingness to imagine something different, design something useful, and create value that did not previously exist. It is the ability to question the obvious answer. It is the ability to look at an accepted process and ask whether there might be a better way. It is the ability to consider the human being behind the system. It is the ability to see possibilities where other people only see limitations. Think about the physician again. Excellence requires the physician to follow proven procedures, maintain accurate records, understand the medicine, and reduce preventable mistakes. Creativity requires the physician to notice when the patient does not fit the standard pattern. Creativity helps the physician adapt the way they communicate. It helps them consider alternative explanation. It helps them design a treatment plan that the patient can realistically follow. The diligent physician does not choose between process and creativity. They understand when to use each one. Consider a restaurant. Excellence is food safety. Excellence is consistency. Excellence is ensuring that the customer receives what they ordered. Excellence is making sure the kitchen operates properly and that the service remains reliable. Creativity is the menu. Creativity is the presentation. Creativity is the atmosphere. Creativity is the way the restaurant makes people feel. Without excellence, the restaurant may be interesting but unreliable. Without creativity, it may be reliable but completely forgettable. Customers return when the experience is both distinctive and dependable. Consider an architect. Excellence is structural integrity. It is legal compliance. It is accurate measurements. It is the correct use of materials. Creativity is how the building uses light. It is how people move through the space. It is the feeling created by the design. It is the relationship between function and beauty. Creativity without technical excellence can be very, very dangerous. Technical excellence without creativity can produce a perfectly compliant building that nobody enjoys occupying. Consider the entrepreneur. Excellence includes accurate financial management, honest communication, reliable delivery, clear processes, and consistent customer care. Creativity includes discovering unmet needs, imagining new business models, designing new solutions, and communicating value in a way that people understand. Creativity produces possibility. Excellence makes a possibility dependable. That is why diligence requires both. For years, we have often used language around left-brained and right-brained people. We described one person as logical, structured, and analytical, kind of like mechanistic. We described another as imaginative, expressive, and creative. That language can still be useful metaphorically, but scientifically, human beings are not divided as neatly as that. Complex thinking involves different networks throughout the brain. We are not simply born as one type of thinker and sentenced to remain that way for the rest of our lives. A better way to understand this is through two different modes of thought. The first is divergent thinking. Divergent thinking expands the options. It explores. It imagines. It asks questions. It looks for possibilities. The second is convergent thinking. Convergent thinking narrows the options. It evaluates. It selects. It refines. It decides. And it executes. Creativity relies heavily on divergence. Excellence relies heavily on convergence. But diligence requires both. Creativity without convergence creates many interesting ideas and very little useful implementation. This is a typical dreamers out there. When we go to the color codes, the greenies, right? Convergence without creativity creates efficient systems that may be solving yesterday's problems. We need the ability to open the conversation and the discipline to eventually actually close it. We need the freedom to explore possibilities and the wisdom to choose responsibly. This is also why thinkers such as Rory Sutherland have argued that psychological approaches can sometimes outperform purely mechanistic ones. Human beings are not machines. We do not make every decision according to a perfectly logical formula. We are influenced by meaning, by emotion, framing, convenience, identity, trust, context, and perception. Sometimes the most effective solution is not to make the machine work faster. Sometimes it is to understand the human beings differently. A mechanistic approach may ask, how do we reduce the waiting time? A psychological approach may ask, how do we make the waiting time feel shorter? A mechanistic approach may ask, how do we provide more information? A psychological approach may ask, which uncertainty is preventing the person from making a decision? A mechanistic approach may ask, how do we force more people through the process? Where a psychological approach will ask, why are people resisting the process in the first place? And we need both. We need various processes that actually work. And we need an understanding of the people who use those processes. My argument, therefore, is that if all of us are called to be diligent, then all of us are called to develop excellence and creativity. That means even if you have a natural tendency towards structures, towards systems, numbers, analysis, the blue brain, you should still be willing to stimulate and develop your creative thinking. And if you have a natural tendency towards ideas, imagination, and expression, you should still be willing to develop discipline, structure, and execution. Your natural preference may explain where you begin. It does not have to determine where your capability ends. You may not become equally strong in every area. That is not the goal. The goal is to become capable of using the right mode of thinking for the right problem. But this brings us to a larger question. In a world where scaling has become a priority for every entrepreneur and business leader, how do we scale diligence? Because both elements of diligence appear to be connected to our personal contribution. Excellence often seems to depend on our personal attention. Creativity often seems to depend on our personal thinking, and our personal contribution is limited by time. We cannot manufacture more hours in a day. We cannot create more time, but we can learn to use our time more effectively. And more importantly, we can learn to transfer the quality of our thinking into other people, processes, systems, and tools. So here's the question. How do we scale diligence? How do we adopt excellence in creative thought processing? How do we scale both? And how do we collectively scale diligence in everything we do? I believe the answer begins with this statement. Diligence begins as personal character, but it scales through organizational design. Diligence may start with the founder, it may start with a physician, it may start with the manager, it may start with one employee who refuses to accept a poor standard. But if diligence remains trapped inside one person, it cannot scale. And eventually that person becomes the bottleneck. Many entrepreneurs believe they have a people problem. They say things such as, nobody cares as much as I do. Nobody does it the way I do. I have to check everything. If I'm not involved, the quality drops. Sometimes that is true, but sometimes the founder has never properly defined the standard, explained the reasoning, trained the person, created the right process, or allowed anyone else enough room to learn. From XCAP's point of view, this is why we have something like company culture development, leadership development, and executive development, because this is one of our core focuses, is the clarity on the diligence and to scale that within a company. So side note, we'll be happy to help you out. Just reach out to us. The founder wants people to read their mind and then becomes disappointed by the team's lack of telepathy. That is not leadership. That is an unreasonable recruitment strategy. To scale diligence, we have to convert personal care into organizational capability. We have to convert what we know into something that, can be understood. We have to convert how we decide into principles that can guide others. We have to convert repeated actions into processes. We have to convert experience into learning. We have to build an organization in which diligence does not disappear when the founder leaves the room. So let us begin with how we adopt excellence personally. The first practical principle is that we must define what good looks like before we begin. People cannot consistently produce excellence when the standard exists only inside someone else's head. Every important task should answer a few basic questions. What outcome are we trying to produce? Who is the outcome for? What must be true for the work to be considered complete? What errors are unacceptable? What decisions may the person make independently? And what would distinguish acceptable work from genuinely excellent work? Consider this instruction. Respond to the customer. That is not a standard, that is a vague suggestion. A clearer standard would be respond within 4 business hours. Acknowledge the customer's actual concern, confirm who owns the problem, and explain the next action. And give a realistic date for the next update. Now the employee knows what good looks like. The customer knows what to expect, and the manager has something meaningful to coach and to manage. The second principle is that we must separate outcome standards from personal preferences. This is one of the biggest barriers to scaling excellence. Leaders often believe that excellence means doing something exactly the way they would do it. But your preference is not automatically a universal principle. The fact that you would use a particular sentence, color structure, or method does not necessarily mean every other method is wrong. We need to separate 3 things. First, the non-negotiable outcome, what must be achieved. Second, the non-negotiable principle, what may never be compromised. And third, the flexible method, where may the person apply their own judgment. For example, in a customer conversation, the customer must feel heard. The real problem must be identified. Not misleading promises or promise may be made. And the conversation must end with a clear next step. Those are standards. But the employee does not necessarily have to use the exact words the founder would have used. Unless the risk or regulation requires a script, there should still be room for humanity. When we control every word, we do not develop judgment, we develop dependence. The third principle is that feedback must happen close to the work. Feedback delivered 3 months after an event is no longer development, it is history. Excellence grows when feedback is timely, specific, and connected to an agreed standard. A useful feedback conversation, asks this. What were we trying to achieve? What actually happened? Where did the results differ from the intention? Why did that happen? What should we repeat? And what should we change the next time? The goal of feedback should not merely be to point out what was wrong. The goal should be to improve the next attempt. The fourth principle is deliberate practice. Experience alone does not guarantee excellence. A person can repeat the same mistake for 10 years and call it, 10 years of experience. Deliberate practice means breaking a larger skill into smaller components and intentionally improving the weaker areas. Take sales as an example. Instead of simply saying become better at sales, we can separate the skill into specific parts. How do you open the conversation? How do you ask questions? How well do you listen? How do you diagnose the real problem? How do you communicate value? How do you respond to objections? How do you close? How do you follow up? Now we can identify where improvement is required. The same applies to leadership. The same applies to medicine. The same applies to communication. The same applies to almost every professional capability. Excellence is easier to develop when the skill becomes visible. The fifth principle is to replace vague intentions with specific behavioral commitments. Saying I must be more diligent sounds admirable, but it does not tell us what to do differently. A better approach is to create a clear if-then commitments. If I complete a proposal, then I will review it once from the client's perspective before sending it. If a customer complaint arrives, then ownership will be assigned before the message is forwarded. If a project misses a milestone, then the team will discuss the cause within one working day. If I am about to make a major decision, then I will write down the assumptions on which the decision depends. These commitments connect diligence to a visible momentum. They turn an abstract value into a repeatable behavior. Now, let's move on to creativity. How do we adopt creative thought processing? The first step is to understand that creativity is not random inspiration. Creativity is not sitting in a colorful room waiting for an idea to arrive. Creativity is a process. A practical definition of creativity is the production of something that is both new and useful. If it is new but not useful, it may be interesting, but it's not necessarily valuable. If it's useful but not new, it may still be excellent, but it may not be creative. Creative thought begins by framing the right problem. Many teams waste time producing excellent answers to poorly defined questions. They say, we need more sales, but that is not necessarily the real problem. A better set of questions might be, where are prospects abandoning the process? What uncertainty is stopping them from buying? What are customers struggling to understand? Are we solving a problem they actually care about? Could we increase recurring value instead of constantly chasing new customers? Could we make the decision simpler? Could we remove friction rather than increasing pressure? The quality of the question influences the quality of the answer. Before solving the problem, we need to make sure we understand it. The next step is to observe reality. Creative thinking should begin with contact. Speak to customers. Watch how the process actually works. Read the complaints. Analyze why people leave. Ask frontline employees what they see. Observe the workarounds customers have created. Pay attention to what people repeatedly misunderstand. Do not only ask people what they want. Ask what they are trying to achieve. Ask what frustrates them. Ask where they hesitate. Ask what they tolerate because they believe there is no alternative. Many of the best creative opportunities are hiding inside accepted inconvenience. Then we move into divergent thinking. This is where we expand the options. One useful method is assumption reversal. Write down everything people assume must be true. Customers must visit us. The service must be sold monthly. The expert must personally complete every step. The customer must learn our system. Training must happen in a classroom. The business must own the product. Reverse the entire assumption. Reverse it. What if the customer never had to visit us? What if the service were not sold monthly? What if the expert only handled the decisions that required genuine expertise? What if the system adapted to the customer? What if training happened inside the work itself? What if the customer owned the system? Not every reversed assumption will produce a good idea, but it will force the mind to move beyond the first obvious answer. Another useful method is analogy transfer. Ask how another industry might approach the same problem. How would a hotel improve this experience? How would an emergency department manage this handover? How would an airline reduce this risk? How would a luxury brand increase perceived value? How would a subscription company create recurring engagement? How would a logistics company track this process? We are not trying to copy another industry blindly. We are trying to transfer principles. Another method is constraint creativity. Instead of asking for unlimited ideas, introduce a deliberate constraint. How would we solve this without hiring more staff? How would we solve this within 24 hours? How would we solve this without building an app? How would we solve this at 1/10 of the cost? How would we solve this so that a new employee could operate it? How would we solve it without asking the customer to change their behavior? Constraints can produce better thinking because unlimited possibility often leads to unlimited discussion. We should also demand idea volume. The first idea is usually familiar. The second idea is often a variation of the first. Only after several attempts do we begin to challenge our assumptions. A team may be required to produce 10 possible explanations for a problem before agreeing on the cause. They may be required to produce 20 possible solutions before selecting one. They may need to produce 5 ideas that do not involve technology, 5 ideas borrowed from another industry, 3 unreasonable ideas, and 3 combination of existing ideas. The purpose is not to implement all of them. The purpose is to avoid falling in love with the first acceptable thought. After divergence comes the incubation. Not every problem must be solved in the same meeting in which it is introduced. So many people do that with their mandatory meetings, virtual meetings, and you see people just losing interest, put on their headphones, walk around their house or coffee shop, and really not contributing to this. Sometimes we need to walk. We need to sleep on the problem. We need to read outside our industry. We need to discuss it with somebody who sees the world differently. We need to allow the mind to continue processing in the background. Incubation is not an excuse to avoid a decision forever, but thoughtful distance can often produce connections that forced concentration cannot. Then we move towards convergence. This is where we evaluate the options. A useful idea should be considered through several lenses. Is it desirable? Does somebody actually want or need it? Is it feasible? Can we responsibly deliver it? Is it viable? Can it sustain itself financially or operationally? Does it maintain integrity? Is it ethical and aligned with our values? And is it scalable? Can it grow without a disproportionate increase in cost, complexity, or quality risk? And is it distinctive? Does it meaningfully improve on the alternatives? The question is not simply which idea do we like? The question is which idea best serves the purpose. Then we prototype. We create the smallest useful version of the idea that allows us to learn. That may be a sketch, a sample report, a role play. paper version of the customer journey. I love mind maps. I love doing that. It may be a landing page, a manual version of the service, a limited pilot, a clickable design. The prototype is not created to prove that we were right. It is created to discover where we may be wrong. Then we test it. What assumptions are we testing? What evidence would support the idea? What evidence would cause us to change it? What is the cheapest responsible way to learn? What happens after the test? Because creativity only becomes innovation when the idea is implemented and creates value. Now we arrive at the central question. How do we scale all of this? Scaling does not simply mean becoming bigger. Scaling means increasing impact, volume, or reach without requiring an equal increase in cost, complexity, founder involvement, or quality risk. That's what scaling is. Business is not necessarily scaling simply because revenue is increasing. If every additional customer requires an equal increase in the founder's personal involvement, the business is growing, but it is not truly scaling. To scale diligence, we need to transfer 5 things from the individual into the organization. We need to transfer the standards. We need to transfer the knowledge. We need to transfer the judgment. We need to transfer the processes, and we need to transfer learning. The central principle is this: standardize what must remain consistent, preserve freedom where judgment creates value. That is how we avoid 2 extremes. The first extreme is chaos. Everybody works in their own way. Nothing is documented. Quality depends on who happens to be involved. Lessons disappear. Mistakes repeat themselves. But then the second extreme is bureaucracy. Every movement requires precision. Every decision requires a meeting. People stop thinking because the process has replaced responsibility. The goal is not to remove human judgment. The goal is to replace or to place human judgment where it creates the most value. The first tool for scaling diligence is principles. Principles guide decisions when the exact situation has not been anticipated. A procedure tells us what to do in a known situation. A principle helps us think in a new situation. Examples of useful principles might include: never hide bad news from a client, resolve the customer's problem, not merely the support ticket, escalate risk very quickly, automate repetition, not responsibility, listen to the person closest to the problem, never sacrifice long-term trust for a short-term sale. Principles allow the organization to maintain its character even when the founder is not personally involved. The second tool is process. Recurring work should be mapped. What triggers the work? What information is required? What steps normally follow? Who owns each decision? Where are the handovers? What quality checks are required? What is the expected output? What feedback should return into the system? The purpose of a process is not to create paperwork. The purpose is to stop valuable work from being trapped inside somebody's memory. The third tool is choosing the right form of documentation. Not every type of work needs the same tool. A checklist ensures that critical steps are not forgotten. A standard operating procedure, an SOP, explains how a repeatable process works. A template reduces unnecessary reinvention. A playbook provides principles, examples, and options for situations requiring judgment. A decision tree helps people navigate predictable decisions, and a policy defines boundaries and authority. A quality rubric explains how the output will be evaluated, and we should use the lightest tool that responsibly supports the work. We do not need a 50-page procedure to explain how to book a meeting. But we also should not rely on a sticky note when managing something with significant legal, financial, or safety consequences. The fourth tool is training. Sending somebody a document is not training. Attending a presentation is not training. True capability requires explanation, demonstration, practice, observation, and feedback. This clarity on everything is the most important goal right there. A person should first understand why the work matters, then they should see what good looks like. Then they should practice, then somebody should observe them. Then they should receive feedback, and eventually they should demonstrate that they can perform independently. For judgment-heavy work, we need more than procedures. We need scenarios. We need case studies. We need ambiguous situations. We need people to explain not only what they would do, but why. The fifth tool is clear ownership. Every important process should answer who owns the final outcome, who performs the work, who must be consulted, who must be informed. What may the owner decide independently? What must be escalated? And at what point must escalation happen? Accountability disappears when many people are involved but nobody clearly owns the result. The sixth tool is measurement. We need to measure both outcomes and the health of the process. Outcomes measures might include customer retention, profitability, ARRs, MRRs, CACs, error rates, delivery performances, clinical outcomes, repeat purchases, or resolution time. Process measures might include handover accuracy, rework response time, quality reviews, compliance with critical standards, or the number of improvements tested. But measurement should help somebody notice, decide, and act. We should not create dozens of metrics simply because a dashboard has enough space. A beautiful dashboard filled with irrelevant data is still irrelevant. The seventh tool is learning loops. Diligence scales when experience improves the system. A practical rhythm is to brief before the work, adjust during the work, and debrief after the work. Before beginning, ask, what are we trying to achieve? What are the risks? What does each person own? What assumptions are we making? During the work, the ask is different. Ask, what has changed? What have we learned? Does the plan need to adapt? After the work, the reviewing phase, ask what happened? Why did it happen? What should we repeat? What should change? And where else does this lesson apply? A debrief should eventually lead to action. Perhaps the individual needs coaching. Perhaps the process needs to change. Perhaps the standard was completely unclear. Perhaps the training was incomplete. Perhaps nothing needs to change because the system worked properly. But if we repeatedly discuss the same failure without updating anything, we are not learning. We are merely producing increasingly detailed descriptions of our own frustration. Now let us look specifically at scaling excellence. The first step is to create minimum excellence standards for the work that matters most. This may include customer onboarding, financial reconciliation, project delivery, clinical documentation, product releases, complaint resolution, or employee induction. For each area, define the purpose, define the required outcome, define the critical steps, define the unacceptable errors, define turnaround expectations, define who must approve the work, and define what evidence confirms that has been completed. Then identify the critical to quality moments. Not every part of a process carries the same risk. Some moments can create financial loss. Some can create safety concerns. Some can create legal exposure. Some can destroy customer trust completely. Some can produce expensive rework. We should place stronger controls around these moments. That may mean a second approval, an automated validation, a customer confirmation, a reconciliation, a sign-off gate, a restricted permission, a mandatory check, The level of control should match the level of risk always. Then we should design common errors out of the system. Telling people to be more careful is not a complete quality strategy. We should ask whether the environment itself can reduce mistakes. Can required fields prevent missing information? Can automated calculations reduce human error? Can a warning identify an unusual value? Can version control prevent somebody from using an outdated document? Can permissions protect sensitive information? Can an automated reminder prevent a missed follow-up? Can a template ensure that critical information is always included? The strongest quality system does not merely demand diligence, it supports diligence. Then we build quality gates. Before work moves to the next stage, certain things must be true. Before a proposal is sent, perhaps the client's need must be verified. The scope must be clear. The price must be checked. The assumptions must be visible. Delivery capacity must be confirmed. The language must be reviewed. The correct terms must be included. This prevents work from moving forward simply because somebody feels finished. Then leaders need to stop personally checking everything. And this is difficult, especially for founders, especially for someone like me. But if every output must pass through the founder has not scaled excellence. The founder has scaled dependence. A better approach is to define that, the standard, train the team, review a sample, track patterns, and adjust the level of oversight based on risk and performance. Low risk work performed consistently well should require less supervision. High risk work, or kind of like that's declining performance, should receive more attention. The goal is not to remove accountability. The goal is to place accountability intelligently. When failures happen, we also need a proper correction system. You can ask, was the statement clear? Was the person trained? Was the process followed? Was the process capable of producing the desired result? Was the required information available? Was the workload reasonable? Was this an individual failure, a system failure, or a combination of both? And what must change to prevent recurrence? Sometimes the person is responsible. Sometimes the system is responsible. Often it's actually both. But blaming the individual for every failure prevents the organization from seeing its own design problems. And blaming the system for every failure prevents individuals from developing responsibility. Diligence requires truth. Now let us look at the scaling creativity. Creativity cannot be scaled by telling people to be more innovative, especially when the first unconventional idea is immediately rejected by leadership. People learn very quickly whether creativity is genuinely welcome or merely printed on the company value poster. To scale creativity, we need psychological permission. People must be able to question assumptions. They must be able to admit uncertainty. They must be able to report problems. They must be able to suggest unfinished ideas. They must be able to disagree respectfully. They must be able to ask for help. This does not mean lowering standards. It does not mean that every idea is good. It does not mean that accountability disappears. The strongest creative cultures combine psychological safety with high performance standards. Safety without standards can become comfort. Standards without safety can create silence. But we need both. We should also separate idea generation from idea evaluation. During the divergent stage, we generate, we question, we combine, we reverse, we explore. During the convergent stage, we evaluate, we compare, we test, we select based on our testing results, we prioritize from what we selected. When both happen simultaneously, the most senior or skeptical voice often closes the discussion before the team has explored the problem properly. We also need to protect capacity from exploration. Every organization has to manage two responsibilities. It has to exploit what already works, and it has to explore what might work next. Too much exploitation creates stagnation. Too much exploration creates endless experimentation without dependable execution. We need to improve the current operation while also making space for future possibilities. That may include operational improvements, customer-led innovation, new services, new business models, process experiments, or long-term research. Innovation cannot depend entirely on whatever energy remains after everybody has finished their normal responsibilities. There is rarely much energy remaining. We also need structured creative briefs. Before beginning an initiative, define the problem, define the person affected, define the evidence, define the constraints, define the desired outcomes, define the non-negotiables, define the assumptions, define the measure of success, and define the next learning milestone. A creative brief should provide direction without prescribing the final answer. Then we create an idea pipeline. Ideas should move through stages. There's observation, problem identification, initial concept, that should be there, the review, the prototype, maybe it's an app build or MVP, test, pilot, and then obviously implementation. And then from the implementation, there's measurement. And eventually either codification or closure. Not every idea deserves implementation, but every serious idea deserves a clear decision. We may test it now, we may research it further, we may combine it with something else, we may save it for later, we may reject it for a clear reason, we may implement it, or we may stop it after testing. This creates discipline around creativity. We should also evaluate ideas as a portfolio. Some improvements should be low risk and immediate. Some should be incremental. Some should focus on the customer. Some should focus on efficiency. Some should be longer term. Some should be experimental. And a small number may have the potential to transform the organization. If every idea must guarantee a return before it is tested, the organization will only approve ideas that resemble what it already does. We also need to reward useful learning. Recognition should not go only to the person whose idea succeeded. Actually, people like Stephen Bartlett with Flight Story and their things, they've got a failure trophy. Ideas, rewarding people's ideas that failed because at least they took it upon themselves to be in a creative thought process. We should also recognize the person who discovered a dangerous assumption early, the person who stopped a weak project before more money was wasted, the person who identified a recurring customer frustration, the person who simplified a process, the person who transferred a useful principle from another industry, the person whose responsible experiment failed but produced valuable evidence. We should not reward careless failure, but we also should not punish every responsible failure. If we punish every failed experiment, people will hide what they learn. And finally, once creativity produces something that works, we must codify it. What worked? Why did it work? Under what conditions did it work? Where should it not be used? What training is required? What measurements should remain in place? Who owns it? When should it be reviewed? This is a point where creativity becomes scalable diligence. The creative experiment becomes a new standard. The organization improves and then the cycle begins again. So how do we bring all of this together in closing? How do we practically scale diligence? I would summarize it through what I call the diligence flywheel. First, define the purpose. define the customer, define the standard, define the non-negotiables. It's very important to define that. And then ask, what does excellence look like? Why does it matter? What level of quality does the risk require? What must never be compromised? And then secondly, explore. Challenge the assumptions. Generate possibilities. Look at the problem from different perspectives. You can ask things like, what problem are we actually solving? What are we accepting unnecessary? What would another industry do? How could this be simpler? How could this be more human? How could this create more value? And then thirdly, test. Convert the idea into the smallest responsible experiment. Things that you can ask are, what must be true for this to work? Which assumption is most uncertain? What is the smallest useful test? What evidence will determine our next decision? And then fourthly, refine. Use evidence and feedback. You can ask, where did reality differ from our expectation? What created value? What created friction? What should be removed? What should be strengthened? What should be redesigned? And then fifth is codify it. Turn successful thinking into principles, processes, playbooks, templates, and decision tools. You can ask things like, what knowledge is trapped inside one person? What should remain flexible? What should become standard? How can somebody else reproduce this outcome? And then sixth is transfer. Train other people. Demonstrate. Allow them to practice. Observe and give feedback. Let them take the responsibility. Things that you can ask is, can they explain the reasoning, not only the steps? Can they perform without constant supervision? Do they know when to follow the process? Do they know when to adapt? Do they know when to escalate? And then lastly, measure. Track the quality. Track the outcomes. Track customer experience. Track efficiency. Ask things like, are we producing the intended result? Is quality remaining stable as volume grows? Where is rework increasing? What early signs indicate that performance is declining? And then learn from it. Thank you so much for joining in today. I hope you found this valuable, and I hope you are able now to scale your diligence.
Welcome to yet another episode of Not Yet Mature, the podcast series talking about life and business, the mix between the two, and hopefully allowing the entrepreneur and founder to find some insights of what the path looks like, or rather should look like ahead. XCAP has a vision that the ethical business that is formed around servitude and relational transactions should be given the advantage to exit the finite space and enter the infinite games. This, collectively, is our mission and our goal. Without further delay, let's dive into today's chat. Here with me, your host, founder of Exemplo Capital, Deon Richter. Like and subscribe, the usual.